But I'd like to talk about three things today. The first of which is what the likely election outcome is and what we need to look out for in the real economy, and then as a derivative of that, in the markets. The second is what monetary policy looks like, both dependent on the election outcome and independent of that. And third and finally, to zoom out a bit and to look at where the Fed is today. Are they actually data dependent? What is part of their formula and what isn't? The first thing is the election. I'd love to come up here and try to hedge myself, and it could go either way. I'm going to just be honest. Donald Trump is going to be the 47th president of the United States. Here's what we know. In 2016 and in 2020, Secretary Clinton and Vice President Biden were up anywhere between 6 and 10 points in the national polls at this point in the election cycle. 6 and 10 points. Kamala Harris is up by 1. Break down the exact figures. Look at the real economy. Look how people are hurting. It's easy for us to look at the markets. It's easy for us to look at the S&P going from 5120 and the lows in August to where we are now, just shy of 5,900. Easy for us to look at our investment portfolios, but the reality of the situation is the economy is hurting. Here's the truth. The top quintile of earners, let's be honest, everyone in this room, the top quintile of earners represent 40% of consumer spending. The bottom quintile, the good people who served us lunch, represent 9%. If they quit spending, we would hardly notice. So the idea that the aggregate economic statistics are sound is not an indictment of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's not to say that the data is rigged. It's that we're measuring the wrong thing. We're not actually measuring how content everyday Americans are with the system. Donald Trump, whatever you might feel about him, is making record inroads with black voters, with Hispanic voters, who are upset about really two issues. That pesky thing called the economy, and that little thing called the border. And nothing's going to get better between now and the next 14 days. In fact, for folks who are saying, well, polls don't matter, elections matter, I agree. And the election is happening right now. As we speak, millions of Americans are showing up early to vote, are sending in ballots. And they're voting based on what their pocketbook has done and based on discontent around the situation at the border. Great. What does all that mean? What it means is to look at the big elements of the Trump agenda. And we can think about the Trump agenda a number of ways. We could spend time, almost the next 40 minutes, talking about what the composition of Congress will look like and how that might affect the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, whether we're going to get that Senate deduction at the same rate it has been for the past couple of years. But what we can spend more time talking about is trade policy, because we don't have to make any assumptions about what happens in the House or the Senate to understand how profound the implications can be for trade policy. And trade policy for Donald Trump was not the idea of buying Greenland that come and went. It was not the idea of infrastructure week. This has been a core policy belief of his, not from the moment he came down the golden escalator, but go back to the 1980s when he took out full-page ads in the New York Times decrying the Japanese for not playing fair in international trade. This is the one issue for Donald Trump, the one he cares about. And whether you like it or not, it's the one where he has the most unchecked power to affect change. I was given the advice very early on in the Trump administration, the first one, to take Trump seriously, but not literally. Take him seriously, but not literally. What does that mean? Well, seriously, he cares about the trade deficit. He cares about what's happening in Appalachia. He cares about the fact that there are 7 million working age men who are neither working nor looking for work. He cares about the fact that we're losing 100,000 Americans every year to fentanyl. Places from Ohio to the textile mills, when you come into New Haven on the Metro North, have been rooted out. Lives and livelihoods are destroyed in the process. He seriously cares about that. Literally, who knows about a 200% tariff on John Deere as some off-the-cuff remark? Who knows whether it's going to be 20 or 30 on this particular country or this particular product? But don't take my word for it. Look at what he did in the first administration. It's all about negotiating. It's all about leverage. It's all about getting the other side to come to the table. Let's not forget that when it was time to renegotiate NAFTA and then rename it and rebrand it as he wants to do with everything, how did he do that? He put tariffs on Mexico and Canada in 2018. Why? Because it was going to bring them to the negotiating table to renegotiate what he viewed as the worst trade deal in history. Remember in the summer of 2019 when he threatened the Mexican president with 5% escalating tariffs every single month unless he secured the border and agreed to put troops on their side of the border as Trump was instituting the Remain in Mexico policy? Those tariffs never went into effect. Again, a negotiating tactic, and it worked. When he told Turkey in 2018, release the pastor, the Christian pastor, Andrew Brunson, or we're going to substantially increase, and this was via a tweet, I will destroy the Turkish economy. He ratcheted up the tariffs, the pastor was released, and months later, the tariffs were reversed. And so anyone out there making bold predictions about 50%, 60% tariffs on China, on all imports, first and foremost has to recognize that for Donald Trump, the art of the deal is twofold. Get leverage and get the other side to come to the table first. It's literally in the book. He wrote a book on this. And so I am always amazed at how the so-called Nobel Prize-winning economic experts fall for the same headlines again and again and again about we're going to do this and we're going to do that. The reality of the situation is we won't know what happens until it happens. You're going to see a lot of headlines when Donald Trump wins over the next couple of years about Trump proposes tariff policy and the market's going to sell off and fixed income's going to sell off and inflation expectations are going to blow out. But we truly won't know what that policy looks like until it's signed on paper. Let's not forget the China Phase 1 trade deal that was signed in January of 2020. That reversed a lot of the tariff increases and really brought a détente that increased agricultural purchases from the Chinese into the US. And so my advice, the advice that I'll be telling myself as these headlines come across, is take Trump seriously, not literally. Don't buy into the narrative volatility. And think really holistically about what this means. We all know what tariffs did, the tariffs that did go into effect, by the way, under Trump. The average tariff rate in many cases going from the low single digits up to 20%. What did inflation do under the Trump term? Well, it averaged 1.9%. Let's not forget, by the way, that of the CPI and PCE baskets, what percentage of that is goods? 30. What percentage of it is imported goods? 12. Talk about inflation, the inflation that we saw in the wake of the record spending, the the record transfer payments, the helicopter payments that were made. Yes, we needed them during the CARES Act, which was unanimously passed by the Senate in March of 2020 and passed quickly into law by President Trump. We needed that. We had lost 20 million jobs in 1 month and a half. Unemployment shot up to 14%. But a year later, unemployment went from 14 to 6, and over 150 million people had immunity to a virus that, I'm going to tell you the truth, turned out to be nothing worse than the flu. The data's there. We now know. What did President Biden do? Spent $2 trillion. Stimulus checks that supercharged the demand side of the economy, along with a negative supply shock to the labor side by paying people to stay at home and not to work. It was the federal unemployment top-off program. The same amount of morphine that you give somebody who has a broken leg is not the same amount of morphine you give them when the cast is coming off. And so it's the inflation of the past couple of years that's been of the services variety. That's where we've seen the inflation. So I'm here just really to talk about the big picture. Yes, we see price volatility. Yes, we've taken out 40, 50 basis points of cuts between now and the end of the year. Yes, the market went from 51.20 in early August to 5,900. But the bigger volatility is narrative volatility. The idea that at the beginning of this year, the Fed was going to cut 7 or 8 times, to at one point Larry Summers mentioning that the next move might be a hike, to they're not going to go in September, they're going to go 25, and then themselves changing their mind at the last minute to the surprise of the market, and then going 50. Liquidity. So beware of the narrative volatility. Second thing is the Fed. The Fed is not data dependent. They're also not data point dependent, which is you get some bad inflation number, some good inflation number, some bad jobs report, some good jobs report. They're not going to overreact one way or the other. They view this as a bigger story. They want to zoom out to where inflation is today, to where it was this time last year, and where was Fed funds today versus this time last year. And they're going to look at that inflation story and say, why did we hike at the fastest rate since a guy named Paul Volcker in the 80s? Because of inflation. And when inflation has gone from 8 to the low 3s, it does make sense for them to pull back some of that accommodation in their mind. And so we just heard today from San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly. She spoke with Nick Timiraos, saying that the recent data does not change her mind about continuing this easing cycle. Now, there's 2 types of Fed easing cycles, and they can be broken down into haircuts. The first is a buzz cut. A buzz cut is 2008. A buzz cut is, holy crap, we need to get rates down to 0. A buzz cut is what happened in the spring of 2020. At even a more expedited and aggressive timeline is there's this thing called the Wuhan coronavirus. Can't call it that anymore, but the Wuhan coronavirus, as it was called in January of 2020. And let's get rates from 2.5 down to 0. Let's kickstart QE. That's a buzz cut. Get rates right down to that 0 lower bound. But then the other type is a trim. And the trim is what happened in 1995, happened in 1998, happened in 2019. What's known as the mid-cycle adjustment. As the economy is changing around the margins, the Fed is recalibrating policy, not because it sees some imminent economic risk like COVID or housing crisis or the dot-com bubble imploding and the NASDAQ going down 80%. They're responding to changes and risks. And in this case, in their mind, that change in risk is the fact that inflation has come off and that the unemployment situation, as the data reports it, has softened a bit. But that's how the Fed's viewing things. How should we view things? Well, the Fed has this fancy metric. They don't even know what it is sometimes. It's called R star. R star is the neutral federal funds rate. And the neutral federal funds rate is where Fed policy should be, where we're neither attempting to stimulate nor restrict growth. Now, according to the Fed, but looking at their summary of economic projections, which just came out last month, they think that rate is 2.9% in nominal terms. Fed funds rate today is 5%. And so there's these all sorts of fancy models how to get to the bottom of R star. What is it? Where is it? I think that Chair Powell put it best, in large part because he isn't a PhD economist. You judge R star by its works. You judge R star and where the Fed funds rate is today relative to that neutral rate by how the economy is reacting. So if they think that neutral is 2.9 and we're currently at 5%, then they think that policy is restrictive. They said so. Mary Daly said it today. Chair Powell has said it. The Democratic senators writing to Chair Powell on official letterhead are saying that policy is too restrictive. But then you go out into the real world, and what do you see? S&P's 5,900, second quarter GDP gets revised up to 3%. Third quarter GDP, according to the Atlanta Fed nowcast, is 3.4%. Unemployment is right at that long-term target. Bitcoin is 67,000. Dave just told us where credit is pricing. In fact, if you ask small businesses, who really are a good barometer of the health of the economy, if you ask them, what is your top concern? It's not the level of interest rates. It's not the availability of financing. The availability of financing for small businesses, according to the National Federation for Independent Business, that concern is shared amongst only 6% of small businesses. What is the top concern? A little thing, not so little anymore, called inflation. And so, zoom out. The economy is not in restrictive territory. Don't tell the Fed that. They cut by 50. They're going to cut by 25 in a couple weeks, and they're going to cut by 25 at the end of December. They're going to do a mid-cycle adjustment, not a buzz cut. They're not responding to some imminent recession that never seems to be arriving. And that's not to discount the real pain in parts of America. But the aggregate economic statistics, the real hard data that the Fed look at, not some survey data from some regional Fed, the real economic data, the labor reports, GDP, lending, retail sales, whether you like it or not, that data is green today. And there's no reason to think that that's not going to continue. And there's every reason to think that as the Fed is easing monetary policy at a time of fiscal deficits, at a time of consumer spending, at a time of loose financial conditions, that the risks are not that inflation necessarily goes back to 9%. But as we stand here today, we can say that the risks are to the upside that the Fed is easing in this environment. And so, to bring it full circle, three things. The first, Donald Trump will win on November 5th, and we will know on November 5th, or very early on November 6th, that he has won. Number two, short term, what the Fed's looking at. They're going to continue easing in November, in December, and they're going to be done. They're going to wait and see what happens. And third and finally, big picture, the Fed is not as restrictive. And that's not my opinion. Take Powell at his word. You judge restrictive by its works. The real data, as we stand here today, does not suggest that Fed policy is holding back the economy. If anything, it will add, and that opens up real risks for investors in 2025. Thank you.